Welcome everybody to episode 13 of our Walk in My Shoes series, where we are beginning the discussion on what kind of society we would like to see built after the recent crisis. Thank you all for joining us. The results and implications of this pandemic are still not fully established, but we're already seeing the economic, societal and political issues being faced by many. However, the position we find ourselves in right now represents a really good time for reflection. For reflection on what we can do to support the transformative challenges that the world is facing. Philanthropy Impact wants to be a place where we can come together to explore how philanthropy and social impact investment could serve as a force for good and create the foundations for a better society. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our CEO John Pepin as chair today, and joining him is our board member and social impact investor Natasha Mueller, John Spiers of EQ Investors and the EQ Foundation, and our members James Maloney of Farr & Co and Martin Short of Power of Nutrition. They will be exploring a range of different ways we can be positive investors for the future of our society. As always, we'll be taking questions from the chat and the Q&A. Please use it. We will try our best to get all questions answered. If we can't, they will be moving it over to the LinkedIn group because 30 minutes flies by. You can also find the recording of today's session there. I'll share that link in the chat in a moment. Thank you all for joining us again today, and I will now hand over to John to make us start.
Sophia, thank you very much, and thank you, James, Martin, Natasha, and John for participating in this. I feel this is probably just the beginning of a discussion that we're going to have about the future. And so I'll start off with the first question to John. What kind of society do we want to build, John? What kind of society would you like to see?
Well, I guess, like most of us, I'd like to see a fairer society with equal opportunity for as many people as possible. I think it's desperately sad that over the course of my lifetime, it's become much tougher if you're unlucky enough to be coming from a disadvantaged background. So I want to see some of those barriers broken down, and that's going to require a change of approach from all of us, I think.
Okay, Natasha.
I'd like to see a world in which the human is at the center of things. I think there are so many types of capital, and I think financial capital has perhaps taken center stage, and I'd like to see a world in which we invest in our communities, in which we collaborate more, and where we come together in a different way, we communicate in different ways. That's what I would really like to see. Instead of everyone sort of operating in their own space, I would love it if we could have more collaboration between government, private sector, public sector, all geared towards, supporting our communities, making them more resilient, and putting the person back at the center of things.
So, can you expand a bit on the person at the center of things?
So I just think part of the reason that we're in this mess is because we didn't get it right the first time around. We didn't pay attention to those voices. We didn't pay attention to the bottom of the billion. We didn't put our money where our mouth is, essentially. And I think now it's really time we do that. And we really look at the role of, what are we doing with our businesses? What are we doing with our employees? What are we doing with our communities? What are we doing with the person? Where's the role for us in this? And not to be subservient to financial capital, essentially.
John, in terms of the kinds of work you do, because you're both a philanthropist and impact investor, how does that all relate to what Natasha's saying in terms of putting the person at the center? Many of the financial institutions operate, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think I really resonates with me what Natasha saying about collaboration. I think that's desperately important. And too often we've seen situations where there's a bit of a battle going on, both between individual charities and between charities and local authorities or government, and often with individual donors, which I guess is the area that I have more experience of, not really feeling very well informed about how well or how badly it's working. So I'm looking for a lot more transparency, far better data. I like to be driven by data. And with each side being able to understand a little bit more about the strengths and weaknesses that they have. I think there's a lot of good things happen in business as well as a few bad things, and it's trying to bring the best from each side. into the pot.
Okay, thank you. Martin, what do you think is needed to achieve that? Have they left something out, and what changes do you think have to be made to actually achieve a fairer society, a human-centered society?
Well, apart from leaving our egos and our logos at the door, John, which I think we should have to do under all circumstances, we've got to, I think, begin at the beginning and understand that we do have a society that is desperately unequal, and there are huge gender issues that we fail to really admit, and there are huge ethnicity issues that we fail to look into, and I think, you know, investing in human capital, no matter what the gender or the ethnicity, is something that I think people should take more seriously. And you know, Natasha, I think, mentioned, you know, the word partnership and collaboration. And those are the two words that are mentioned more in philanthropy and done less in philanthropy than I think that I could ever understand. And you know, it's very typical when we look at all the foundations in the world, and we all say that we're going to collaborate. They all go back to wherever the home base is, and they say, it's fantastic, we're going to collaborate, we're all going to do it my way. And that's the issue all the time. And the fact is that, you know, cooperation partnership are incredibly difficult to do, because it requires two things. It requires equity, and it requires compromise. And people don't like to compromise, and people want to actually build things in their own image. And until we actually understand that we should look at the 80% that actually unites us, as opposed to the 100 or the 20% that divides us, we're not going to get very far.
Okay, and how do you see us starting to make that change?
Well, we're going to have to make it, because there's going to be less money and more people wanting less money. And the only way you're going to be able to actually get those to those beneficiaries and the people that need is actually making the money go further, which requires people to cooperate, which requires people to understand the role of governments, the role of the private sector, and development's got to become a lot more efficient in the way that it executes its business, and understand this whole shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, both in the private sector, but also have that mindset in development. I think there's going to be you know, a significant fallout with a lot of the bilaterals having 20% less money to distribute, and a lot of the INGOs and those people who've got footprints in those countries with significant burden of need are going to have to look at other sources of finance, and that is going to require us to think differently outside the box, and to definitively collaborate, because otherwise we're going to find that we've got even less money to distribute. And so I think this is going to be writ large for us to be able to think through a different paradigm.
So James, based on what you've heard so far, in the past, a lot of the change that was taking place by charities and others was to a certain extent Band-Aid and not systemic. Do you see that what Natasha and Martin and John are talking about is going to lead to systemic change, and what do you see are some of the challenges and opportunities there?
Thank you, John. I'd really like to pick up, again, at the risk of repeating what others have said, what Natasha said about collaboration, because from an advisor's perspective, I think this is also hugely important. I do see clients that are really engaging with the issues of systems change, and that do want to make a transformative effect through their philanthropy. I think what they need from advisors is collaboration as well to help them achieve this, because when a philanthropist reaches out to their advisors, they don't want to have bits and pieces of advice delivered in silos. They want to have advisors that work together, and to achieve something holistic that is going to promote systems change. You also need advisors that are capable of realizing which parts of the jigsaw they bring, and where they might helpfully bring other people into the client's network.
Okay, and then
John, can I jump in there for
yeah,
1
you
second?
can.
Because I agree with so many of what everyone is saying. And you asked, like, how do we get into that collaboration? It's really tricky, and it's what I'm grappling with at the moment. And I love what you said, James, about advisor collaboration, because I think that's fundamental. And I'm part of the co-impact group, and we were looking at like the different types of philanthropists on there, and you see it as a spectrum, like with impact investors, and often at the end is a systems change one. And that's kind of when you've been doing philanthropy for a while. And I've gotten to that point where I do a lot of philanthropy and mental health. I've got a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources, and what I'm doing, I just don't feel it's enough. And that's when I'm reaching out to like other advisors to find those platforms to be like, how can I look at the other areas that affect mental health? And I think if we can encourage advisors to be able to help with that, to use the convening power of advisors, that would be spectacular.
Found it quite fascinating, James, in making the comment about advisors and the role of advisors, because clients are now, I think there was recent research that showed about 67% of wealthy people are going to their advisors if they want to start looking at major donor gifts. And we still feel that close to 80% of the advisors aren't prepared to support them in that whole process. Is that your perception?
Well, I hope it isn't, in the sense that from my colleagues and those that I see around me, I think there is a real willingness and capability to help, and I think that's true of many advisors. But I'm sure there are parts of the advisory space where there is still a lack of confidence. People don't necessarily feel they understand the issues. They don't necessarily feel they understand what their clients are looking to achieve enough. They aren't having the right conversations with clients, and they aren't asking the right questions. And I think you really have to have a degree of confidence to do that. And I think as an advisory community, we do need to step up and do that a bit more.
John, are you getting the sense of that as well?
Yeah, I think this is a bit sweeping, but I would say the whole, this sector in terms of, the advice side, it feels a bit like private client investing did to me 50 years ago. Frankly, it's pretty amateurish. I'm not saying everyone's amateurish, but there's some pockets of excellence out there, but they're quite hard to find. And for the majority of people, it's really hard to get good advice at a reasonable price too. So there's just a massive need to revolutionize this with better information, better systems, better training.
Okay, James, did you want to say something? No.
No, it's really interesting to hear John's perspective on that, and I do recognise some of what he says.
Okay, but Martin, you're coming from the other side. So you're a receiver of funds. You bring people together to distribute funds. Where do you sit in this whole discussion, not just about advisors, but about the how? How do we deal with the challenges and stuff? Because I'm still not getting a sense that people are talking about a fair society, human-centric, et cetera, but I'm still not getting a sense of what's down the road and what can happen.
Well, the landscape is pretty complicated, and when we're looking at the original financial advisors and the transparency of markets and prices and things which are tangible and stock markets, and you can see where you can give advice which is actually reasonably easy to judge whether or not A, it's good, B, whether it's fair, and C, whether it's at the right price point. When you're looking at the philanthropy and human capital, and start thinking about in countries where many people find difficulty finding them on a map, and then understanding all the complexities around whether or not we're dealing with an Ebola issue or COVID-19 issue, whether we're dealing with gender, whether we're dealing with slavery, with human rights. These landscapes are incredibly complicated and very there is not one size fits all. There isn't a particular price point, and there are many INGOs as well as NGOs working in the space, which can make it, I think, extraordinarily difficult to navigate for the philanthropists and the advisors that are giving them some guidance on that. So I think that the government, if you look at where you're really going to get significant change, is where you're going to have systemic reform, because systemic reform will drive sustainability to an extent. And a lot of these philanthropists, a lot of these INGOs, and sometimes people like myself, will decide to do what I call a romantic project. And I don't mean, actually, I do mean to be unkind, because a lot of them are romantic projects that have impact in the moment, but don't have any sustainability. They will save lives in the moment, and that is, very laudable. But in the longer run, what you really want to do is that, we have to ask the question: when I leave, will that project continue to function and be hardwired into the budgetary systems of government? That's ultimately the question that everyone has to ask themselves, because if the answer is no, that doesn't mean you don't do it. You just got to change your expectations of what outcome is and your definition of success. Saving lives is always going to be good, but if you leave and those projects just disintegrate because there's no infrastructure around them, then ultimately all you're going to have is somebody doing exactly the same thing, maybe looking at the same people with the same results year after year, and that doesn't really have a significant amount of traction to it.
John, how do you address that as a philanthropist then?
Sorry, the sound dropped away from me there, John.
I'm just wondering how you address the issues that Martin just said about sustainability and longevity, etc., as a philanthropist.
I very much endorse what he's saying. I think, but I think it's it's often, you can often see a very good solution that may not be sustainable without the people carrying in place doing it, and you feel, well, I want to help these. These are good people, and it's clearly doing some good, and think about the sustainability a bit further down the track sometimes, where there's a crisis here. Let's deal with this now. I think in this whole sector, it's very hard to generalize. There's such a vast range of different needs and different problems that people are trying to solve. And I personally find it's helpful to have some principles and some things, but I have to flex them that often in the real world of actually what's available out there and what my heart is telling me that I should be doing.
Okay, Natasha, you're focused on mental health, and you're funding in a number of different ways in Africa and other places. How do you deal with this? Because if you assume that a lot of the issues around mental health are related to poverty and inequality, how do you address that? Because you're one person and you're spending money, but what do you do?
Yeah, it's really hard. I just want to say, I agree very much with what you're saying, Martin. And I think that's in the sense there are different types of philanthropy. And I think the kind of short-term immediate giving is very necessary, like you said, to save lives. And I've done that quite a bit recently with COVID, but even so, before that happened, I had a strategy, or I try to have a strategy, and I think long-term. And to your point about the mental health, yeah, it's tricky. And to make it sustainable, what I found is you either need to partner with grassroots campaigners and grassroots NGOs that are already on the ground and tie them into like a larger group, or if you can have some kind of advocacy or lobbying piece. Those are the two ways I found are really good, are really, really effective ways of making it a little bit long-term and sustainable, and to really get the voices at the bottom, like of the people with lived experience who are at the bottom, who are saying, this is what we need. I don't have an answer for linked to income inequality and mental health. I'm looking at it, and that's what I meant. So when it comes to systems change, that's why collaboration is so important, because I don't know how to address that. I don't know early prevention and mental health in school, so I'm trying to figure out which foundation would be a good partner for me, because I don't have a foundation. I prefer to work with others and let the experts kind of lead the way, and I support them. And like what I've done on the mental health side, the first organization I supported was United for Global Mental Health, which is an advocacy. And they brought in grassroots campaigners from all around the world, in Nigeria, Liberia, Nepal, Pakistan. And then I support it as well by like donations on the ground. Yeah, now I'm really trying to figure that out, how I can like deepen the systems approach that I've taken so far, because I think I need to do that, and I need kind of partners to be able to do that.
James, when you're...
John, can I just come back for a second?
Go ahead, yeah.
I mean, the other thing I think, what I try to work with the organisations I support is to how can they move towards a sustainable funding basis, and you know, if they're doing good work, then there are beneficiaries who are getting, you know, somewhere along the line, someone is clearly being helped by this, and that means ultimately there's somebody going to be prepared to pay for that. You know, it might be central government, it might be the beneficiaries themselves, but somewhere along the line, you can turn it, some of that, obviously not necessarily to cover all the costs, you can reduce the reliance on voluntary donations, and I think that's pretty critical for a lot of interventions.
Yeah, we tried to bring in the healthcare, the Ministry of Health when we do our mental health interventions, because then it's sustainable, and then you can also access the healthcare funding that the government provides, and then you combine that with philanthropic giving, then you combine that with grassroots activism, and then you have the whole shebang.
James, when you're talking to your clients, what's their immediate concerns these days, and how does it relate to what John and Natasha are saying and what Mark described?
Sorry, John, I lost the sound just for a moment.
Oh, okay. So when you're talking to your clients and supporting them in various ways, are there what is their need? Where do they stand? What are they asking you? And is it related to what Natasha and John were talking about and Martin was describing?
I think that is something I'm seeing. I mean, it's very difficult to generalize because philanthropy is so individual and personal, and what I've seen with the current pandemic and people's responses to it is very much that. You know, some philanthropists are most concerned about sort of protecting and ensuring the survival of charities and NGOs that they fund that might be in very short-term desperate financial need. Some of them have perhaps developed new interests in areas that they wouldn't necessarily have thought of before. But those who do tend to be more sort of strategic, long-term and systems focused in their philanthropy, I guess this has given them a new, a sort of additional incentive, and has demonstrated just how global and complex a lot of the problems that we face are, and how sort of real systems change is difficult, frankly.
It's very interesting because we're talking about a minority of very wealthy people here, aren't we? Because if you think in terms of high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals, the median gift is $4,000 a year, which means half of the wealthiest people in this country are giving less than $4,000, which also means that the top 5 to 10% of wealthy people are giving most of the 2 to 3 or 4 billion a year from those groupings. How do we start to address that? Because that's part of the systemic problem, isn't it? There's just not enough money out there to achieve what you're trying to achieve. Anyone?
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, you're absolutely right, and I think part of the reason is that the experience for a donor is pretty poor. You know, you find, you know, you get invited to some nice dinners, and you might go out to Africa and see some stuff for a few days, and you've made to feel like a king. But you're not getting really high quality data that links you to the effectiveness of the organization, and as a result, doubts grow in your mind about, well, okay, these seem like really nice people, but actually, are they really doing any good? Especially if somebody else has a bit of a go at them. So fundamentals, you know, in people's minds of, I'm really glad I support this organization. You know, I can see they're doing good, and I've got the metrics to show these guys are, I'm right up near the top of the class here. And I not only am happy to carry on backing them, I'm going to tell my mates about them. You know, in the investment world, when you've backed something that's gone up 2 or 3 times, a lot of people like talking about it and showing how clever they are. I think in charity, in the philanthropic world, people are very nervous about saying things about it, partly because they're not, you know, they don't feel confident in their knowledge level, and they're worried that someone will say, I've heard that charity is doing all sorts of bad things, you know, and they don't have the evidence to refute that.
Okay, but okay, so we have the situation that you described. Natasha, you were talking a bit about some of the systemic changes you're trying to bring government involved and other players involved. But I mean, if we again look at poverty and inequality and deal with such issues as racial bias, then there's a long way to go, and people are starting to take positive steps towards that. But why is it no one or hardly anyone mentions universal basic income as a way of eliminating poverty overnight?
They're experimenting with that in Spain, actually. The government is just, they're just experimenting with that, partially because of that, because they don't know how else to support, or how else to do, because redistribution of wealth via taxation is not happening. And philanthropy can also be often be criticized as just being like a Band-Aid. I'm pretty sure there are quite a few famous books about that have come out recently. And it's one thing, I don't know whether it's going to work, but there is a discussion going on in Spain at the moment about that. And in Switzerland, we had a vote about it, but it didn't pass. But there is something to that. I would definitely, it would be something to consider. And there's another, sorry.
Go ahead, Martin.
Okay, sorry, Natasha, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It was you just got me so excited there about your comment. But you know, cash transfers. A lot of this comes from poverty, and we can't really escape this. That if you don't have disposable income, you're going to buy the wrong types of food. You don't have enough to educate people. You're not going to have enough disposable income to either buy a product for your family or indeed gather the natural amounts of IQ to be able to hold down good jobs without having high absenteeism rates and all the like. So actually, putting cash transfers in place, as we've done in many countries and that we work within, actually is a leveler. The problem partly is, though, is it sustainable, or as John said, who's going to pick up the check to continue that day in, day out? It doesn't, the NHS in the UK is not sustainable. It just, somebody writes $150 billion check on January the 1st every year. Now, that's fine, and that's great, but it's not as if there's a product being actually created here. So when we're thinking about that sustainability, somebody ultimately has got to pick up some, all, or part of that check to be able to have a system that is in place, whether it's universal health coverage or whether it's a minimum amount of disposable cash to be able to afford to buy things and to live. So these are complicated issues, but poverty in of itself actually is one of the major drivers here that drives so many of the issues that we're talking about today.
Be interesting to go back to when the arguments took place right after the Second World War, and when universal Medicare was brought in at a time when the government actually owed billions from the war, and there were big issues. It'd be interesting to go back and see what the arguments were at that time. Anyway, we're just about out of time. This has been brilliant. Thank you very much. What I would like to do is continue the discussion a second time in the meeting, where we actually move towards concrete solutions and how to bring the change that we're all talking about. So thank you. Could we have words of wisdom from each one of you about this whole issue and where we take it forward? Maybe we can start with James.
I suppose three things that I've taken from the discussion, but also from my own experience. It takes time to really understand, as an advisor, take time really to understand what your clients are trying to achieve. Develop your own knowledge about philanthropy and impact investing, and bring in others, collaborate, grow your network, and use that network to help your clients to achieve their goals.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. John?
Gosh, could you come back to me a second? I've got
Sure.
so many thoughts I want to rationalize.
Okay. Martin?
Yeah, listen, metrics and data are incredibly important. I don't think there is a place for glossy pictures and flies on eyes anymore in philanthropy. I think we've got to be much more grown up than that. We mentioned collaboration, partnership. Let's do it rather than talk about it. And I think there's going to be less money around. The ability to partner, or the need to partner, is going to be absolutely writ large, and we've got to make sure that we get the amplification doing projects in country alongside and with the buy-in of those recipient governments. If we can get governments to value human capital as they do value power and infrastructure projects in the same breath, on the same level playing field, this is all doable. Just, politicians don't like getting photographed in front of school kids necessarily. They love being photographed in front of dams and bridges and roads. That's a reality on a 5-year electoral cycle. We've got to try to make these countries value human capital much more.
Okay, John, are you ready, or do you want to wait?
Yeah. I think the single most important thing for me would be to be able to link effectiveness much more clearly to donors and end up with the best charities getting the money, not the ones with the best fundraising teams. Ultimately that would drive the change, and it would drive consolidation, which is badly needed.
Okay, Natasha, next to final word.
Okay, 3 quick things based on kind of what I'm grappling with at the moment. First thing is, I would encourage donors and advisors to really do unrestricted funding. If you only fund projects, it's really, really hard. Charities need good talent, and that's why they don't have working capital to hire great people and to hire employees, and these are the fundamentals. Second, there's a really cool product that I'm currently exploring that I would encourage advisors to check. It's called social impact bonds, and it is a great example of collaboration because it's based on outcomes, as you're saying, and you're bringing in NGOs and government and private investors. It's something I'm looking at as an impact investor. And the last one is, I am in the process of deepening my systems change impact. I'm looking for a global platform because most donations are done locally. Most people tend to have a local view. It's great. It's a global crisis, a global problem. So if there are any ideas, I would welcome some thoughts on where I can find this global platform.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so we've gone 2 minutes over, so I'm going to take us 3 minutes over, so I can see Sophia is ready to cut me off. What I'm getting from this is a tremendous amount of optimism that there's a lot of work to be done, but things will be different. And I'm really looking forward to our next discussion on this topic, is making it happen. Hey, thank you very much for your contribution. It was really great. Thank you.
Well done, John.
Okay, Sophia, over to you. Sophia.
Unmute. Sorry,
Okay.
guys. Just saying thank you to everyone. Next week we will be looking at how to encourage more giving, inspiring philanthropy and social investment. And there is still time to register for our virtual event on Wednesday, which is around this topic, where the panel of experts will be exploring shared learning, social impact investment as a game changer. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.